All right, it looks like we're about 2:02, giving people some time to jump on. Mike and Jennifer, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael Davis. I am the parking program manager with Fairfax County's Land Development Services, and we're working on a project that involves looking at parking in the county holistically, looking at our parking ordinance and looking at that to determine if changes to the ordinance should be made, both from an administrative point of view as well as from parking rates and other regulations associated with that. And we have a presentation today, and I'm going to see if I can pull that up. And let's see if I can find the full screen. Bear with me for a moment. There we go. So as I said, we are looking at a project that examines the parking requirements in Fairfax County holistically. The project goals that we have are primarily associated with reviewing, updating, and simplifying parking rates, as well as streamlining parking reviews and approvals. And this project is intended to get a lot of community engagement, and this meeting today is part of that effort to engage the community as a whole, as well as elements of the community and different organizational groups. And today's meeting with religious assembly leaders is intended to get some specific feedback on religious assembly uses in the county and parking associated with those. And that effort of getting feedback from this group will help us in our analysis of best practices for parking, specifically for religious assembly, as well as a whole in Fairfax County, all uses in Fairfax County. And our intent is, since we haven't looked at the ordinance holistically since the late 80s, that a lot has changed since that time. The internet being one large factor in changing behavior for drivers, in the sense of, now you have options to order online and have it delivered. You have options for telework and those sorts of things. And those are just two of many changes that have occurred over time that we want to try to capture as far as innovation is concerned. And even with religious assembly, one thing that could continue in that regard is in response to the pandemic, religious activities have gone online, religious services and that sort of thing have occurred online. And that may also be something that continues, that specifically affects this particular use, giving people the option to attend services virtually rather than in person. So that's one small factor as well that could go into how we look at parking. Just to summarize our current requirements, in the ordinance, our minimum parking requirement is 1 parking space per 4 seats within the religious assembly space. Clearly, one of the things that we are looking at is the designation of seats has an implication to worship that takes place in a pew or sitting down. But certainly there are religious assembly activities that don't have that easy ability to measure that. And so that's part of the thought process that's going into how we're looking at religious assembly and parking, is trying to find a measurement that works for a variety of worship options. The other relevant factor for the current requirements is that religious assembly with childcare, private schools, specialized instruction centers, or community facilities all require that those to be parked separately, technically, from the ordinance. There are options in the ordinance to be able to allow for shared parking amongst these uses, but the baseline is that all of these uses have to be tabulated separately, and the parking ostensibly designed for all these separate uses. And one note that we wanted to share is that typically when a religious assembly use comes before the county as part of a special exception or special permit, typically as part of those negotiations, staff usually requests the applicant to provide a minimum of one parking space per 2.5 seats rather than the one parking per 4, based on staff's experience with parking demand at these locations, these religious assembly uses, and that staff experience has gone into that recommendation, but that is not aligned with the minimum ordinance requirement. So that's kind of one of the things that we want to look at, is trying to make those mesh together better. Along those lines, we've been looking at a few options so far for religious assembly, and this is still a work in progress. We are kind of at the midpoint of our project, which you'll see later in a later slide. We're kind of at the midpoint of this project. We received a proposal from our consultant, who's Nelson Nygaard. We received a proposal from them in early January with regard to approaches for parking, as well as potential rates associated with all the uses in the county. Staff has also been working very hard to gather data and look at other scenarios and rates from other jurisdictions to see where we fall and where we could fall going forward. And so as part of that, we're trying to find, for a lot of uses, including religious assembly, we're looking at the possibility of moving from a sort of a persons-based approach for a number of rates, or like number of employees, number of people within the space, number of employees, that sort of thing, and trying to move away from that to something that is measurable at any time of the project, whether it be at the beginning or whenever it's being permitted for use. And so part of that thought process is using a square footage measure potentially instead of seats, as a way of measuring the parking need for a particular site. We're also looking at, as part of developing a potential rate for parking, to have a situation where we don't have separate parking requirements for associated uses within the religious assembly. A lot of religious assembly uses have childcare centers. They have community serving activities. They have specialized instruction centers and that sort of thing. And so if we can find a parking rate that works to serve all of that, all of those options, that's something that we are very interested in achieving. And then the other element to that is kind of sort of moving up, kind of in an opposite direction from today's circumstance, is that if there are particular religious assembly uses that can show us that the parking demand is not typical of a religious assembly, the religious activities may take place not at a formal time, but people can just come and go and engage in their religious activities without a scheduled specific time period, or if the religious assembly facility is just devoted to religious assembly without these other activities going on. Those are circumstances that we would kind of consider a lower parking requirement for that circumstance, rather than a higher parking requirement to try to encapsulate all of these other activities that are going on at the site. So, as part of the approach, we're looking, as I said, potentially a square footage measure rather than seats. And this is just a comparative chart of options that could be considered for both categories. The seats, we list out the current requirement, which is 1 space per 4 seats. And if you have a 200-seat assembly, then that number of spaces would be 50. And so then it shows kind of a graduated scale of requirement from 50 to 80 based on the ratio of seats to spaces. And then for square footage, to kind of draw a sort of similar or parallel approach, looking at number of spaces per 1,000 square feet. And you could look at it in 2 ways. You could look at the specific assembly area within the larger facility and do a measure based on that, which is the 12 spaces per 1,000. And then, or you could take the building as a whole and do a calculation in that way. So the project timeline, as I alluded to earlier, we're kind of in the middle of this project. We started last August, kind of with bringing the consultant on board and beginning our work. But in October of last year, we did a presentation to the board and planning commission to kind of kick off the project formally. And we have been we've had some outreach already on the project with district supervisor town halls and meetings with various groups and committees. We've also engaged in discussions with other municipalities, both locally and nationally, to get important information on how they operate their parking ordinance. So at this point, we have a proposal together that discusses a tiered framework for parking that would be aligned with development areas from least intense to most intense, to kind of simplify that, as well as a draft rate table. We'll be going to the Board of Supervisors in June to update them on where we are. And then at that point, we intend to re-engage with the community very vigorously with meetings that we'll have between June and October before we get to a point where we can put together a draft recommendation for the Planning Commission and the board to consider either late this year or early in 2023. And just briefly, our project website is shown here, and it has a lot of details on the project, where we are with the project, a lot of background information, particularly in the white paper that's discussed here, FAQs and presentations. We've done a number of presentations that you can link to get background information on the project and other information relative to the project. And that is updated very frequently, so you can keep coming back and seeing more information. It also provides opportunities for citizen comment and community input at that level as well. So with that, this wraps up our little presentation, but what we really want to hear today is from the participants, the religious leaders that are participating today, are your experiences with parking at your sites, or what you know about other religious assembly sites, kind of that collective experience, if you will, about parking issues or thoughts associated with how parking should be provided. And then feedback, if you have feedback today on the rates and other options, the options that we've put out, as well as other options to share with us today, that would also be very helpful. So with that, I will move the screen back to the website. But I think now we're ready for any questions or discussions associated with today's presentation.
And I did drop a link to the webpage in the chat for anyone. And we'll work to get the, we're recording this presentation, so we'll work to get it uploaded towards the end of the week.
I mean, I guess I'll jump in with some observations. I'm David Oakley. I'm the executive pastor, brand new in the last couple of weeks at Knollwood Community Church over in the Burke area. I'll just speak from our experience. I think every church that we've attended or been a part of has always struggled for having enough parking, especially when it comes to times of their worship services. And Knollwood really is not an exception to that. I mean, again, pre-COVID, as we were hitting 2/3 or so of our sanctuary being full, we were already beginning to feel like our parking lot was full and having to kind of begin to think about managing that process. So I guess as there's been a lot of work done here, and it looks very interesting, but anything that would try and lessen the parking for religious organizations based on the sanctuary size, I think will become problematic. I think if we drive down below the I guess the 2.5, or I guess go up from the 2.5, it starts to, I think 2.5 always maybe doesn't even accurately reflect the need even today. So that's my sense. I mean, the difference between square footage versus the sanctuary, I've always thought the sanctuary number was a pretty good place to base it on, just because it's your highest need moment for the site. But as long as it kind of creates a solution that allows for a sufficient parking, I think that it doesn't really matter where it's based from. In my mind, I do think taking into account the differences, like we have a preschool here, but that's Monday through Friday. So to integrate that with the worship and the parking needs, I think makes a lot of sense. So I don't know, I'll stop there, but that's just a kind of a gut level reaction.
Well, and just to clarify, I think, I don't want to have those who are participating today misunderstand what we're doing. We're just looking at trying to establish a minimum requirement. We're not setting a situation of that's the maximum amount that you would be providing in association with the rates that we've been talking about. So, I think what I heard you saying, Mr. Oakley, was that you want to have this opportunity to be able to build more parking if you feel like you need it for your facility. And that is okay as part of this discussion. We're just trying to find a place where we need to establish a baseline minimum for religious assembly. And so that I just wanted to make it clear that that's where we are. We're not trying to impose a maximum in association with this, with the rate that we're looking at.
Great, thanks for that.
Hi, can I speak?
Sure.
Yeah, my name is Ed Settle from Messiah United Methodist Church. I just got this definition of seats is I think needs to be fleshed out more in order to really comment on it, because are we talking about a normal Sunday, talk about Easter or Christmas? Where do we set that date? And that makes a big difference on the requirement. And I'm just trying to understand, is this retroactive? I mean, if we somehow, or one of the churches somehow does not meet the requirement, do they have to add parking?
Well, to answer the latter question, we don't want to put religious assembly in that situation of having to add parking. We still have to figure out if we change the rate to require more parking, we would have to grandfather the existing facilities. We've done that similarly with restaurants. When we changed the restaurant rate, it did have some implications to existing facilities. And so we added language to the ordinance to allow that grandfathering to occur. So if the rate does change, that it requires more parking, then we would have to consider that as well. But then the other question you had was about seats, and the rate that we have today based on seats, or if it was to go to square footage, would still be, it wouldn't be seasonal in nature, in the sense that, you know, we're not trying to build or have requirements that have parking meet the seasonal peak for any use, whether it be religious assembly or retail or office. You know, we're trying to address the average demand when we are looking at creating a parking rate or having a parking supply. So I don't know if that answers your question about the seats measurement, but I did want to note that we're not trying to build parking for the worst case scenario.
Yeah, it answered my question. Thanks.
Does anybody else have any thoughts about how the current rate works for them? You know, we've had a couple of situations in the past where religious assemblies, organizations have tried to get themselves established, particularly in buildings that aren't designed for a religious assembly use per se. Like, we've had requests for establishing the use in office buildings, in warehouses and things like that. And my personal experience with that has been that the religious assembly group wants to use that 1 to 4 minimum rate to make sure that their parking will work relative to the other uses that are in the building. Sometimes, depending on the timing of the worship, that it's sort of a natural circumstance that the parking demand offsets, but sometimes the worship coincides with other things that are going on the site. And so they've really kind of relied on that 1 to 4 to be able to get themselves established. So I don't know if anyone in the audience today has had that experience of trying to make that work, or if there have been any concerns about a situation where if 1 to 4 is required, but staff is asking for a higher number of spaces, whether that has presented problems.
Hi, my name's Jamie Curry. I'm with Temple B'nai Shalom in Fairfax Station. I can't speak to that last question, Mr. Davis, because we have our own building. But I did just want to sort of tag on to what Mr. Oakley said, that generally speaking, our experience is also that our parking is lacking for the amount of space that we have in our building. And you showed your timeline, and it sounds like you guys have done a lot of considerations into these sort of new proposed rates. I'm curious if you've done anything in analyzing the existing buildings, their parking and their seats, because it seems like you're getting some feedback here that right now we don't have enough parking. And I'm curious if you've looked at what the existing stock is, what the rate actually translates to. I mean, we probably have a lot of old buildings, that might not be quite in alignment with the current policy anymore, and to see where we stand in making this decision.
Well, there's quite a bit of variation. I did a survey a number of years ago, probably, 4 years ago, in association with a work project where I had gone out. I'd gone out on a Sunday morning to look at worship parking demand. And at some locations, there was plenty of available parking, unoccupied spaces. But at other locations, there was quite a bit of demand, and a lot of the parking spaces were full. So part of it is, for us, we're trying to find this minimum rate that will work, so that we don't put ourselves in a situation where we're approving something that kind of just out of the box is not going to it's not going to meet the parking requirement or the parking demand, I should say. So, that argues for having some sort of minimum requirement. But the other thing that we want to assure everyone is that there's no, if there's a way of accommodating parking, like if there's a parking problem on the site today and you have space to expand the parking, this is not meant to hinder that. There could be other factors on the site, obviously, that prevent you from expanding the parking, like the size of the site or other proffered commitments or conditions that are associated with the approval for the use that require preservation of open space and other elements of the site. But, this project itself is not designed to limit the amount of parking that any particular use wants to provide generally in the county, for 95% of the county. So, so from that point of view, Jamie, I don't know if you have an ability to expand your parking on the site that you're asking about, but certainly we're not trying to discourage that.
So this is Bill Malin, zoning administration, and we did look at the last 5 years of approvals for special permits related to religious assembly uses, which also include, religious assembly that had childcare or private schools. And we found on average, they were coming in at 1 space per 2.5 seats, which is the way Michael talked about earlier, where the ordinance is 1 per 4. So they're parking at a higher rate than the ordinance would require. And so that was almost all the uses we looked at that, but definitely they were right at 1 to 2.5. So there may be more demand than even that, but that's where we at least 5 years of review. And we know, without having looked at the data, we know in general, zoning evaluation has been asking for that general type of number for probably close to the last 20 years, 1 to 2.5 spaces.
This is Anne Marie McKinnon at the Catholic Diocese of Arlington. I just want to be clear. I mean, I know in many different contexts, commercial contexts, retails, the county is looking to reduce parking requirements, but churches are incredibly context specific, especially since many of them are on residentially zoned land. So is the county looking to cap parking in particular areas of the county with regard to religious institutions?
We, as part of the proposal that we have, and Austin, it might be helpful to put up the map, the latest map that we have of our proposal, if you're able to do that. I don't know if I need to.
You'll probably need to stop sharing first.
Yeah, Mike, just stop sharing your screen and then I'll throw it up.
All right, where's my cursor? There it is.
So just the only place right now we're talking about potentially having maximum for parking in general context are those areas in Tyson's and then metro stations, right by the metro stations where they would opt into a parking maximum and have lower minimum requirements or no minimum requirements. But we're not really talking about maximums. For religious assembly, I would say generally when they come through the process, staff is usually looking for more parking than the minimum.
Correct. That's been our experience.
And where the potential issues or concerns may be if that facility is located in an area that might have environmentally sensitive areas, there may be a desire to preserve that environmental sensitive areas, in addition to try to balance the need for parking. So that would, certainly that's a very specific case that probably happens quite a bit, but that would be an individual case by case review. So that's going to be in your RC areas, residential conservation areas, where a special permit or a special exception would be reviewed by staff, and they would be able to look at the context, as you mentioned, determine, is this appropriate amount of parking, or is there another need that needs to be considered in addition to the parking needs?
I mean, oftentimes county staff encourages shared uses, but that we cannot, neither staff nor the applicant can compel that.
Very true. Yep.
And then if that shared use is seeking some sort of compensation in conjunction with the shared use, that's an additional burden. Also, I think you said, Tyson's being a whole different ball of wax. As I understand it, there aren't any civic uses whatsoever in Tyson's. So I guess this is more of a sort of a speculative question for that area.
So yeah, the PTC district is a specific zoning district in the Tyson's area, does have maximum parking areas. And it's, if Austin can kind of circle us, the purples in there. And we're looking at potentially allowing people in transit areas to opt into that. So in that particular case, there may be maximums, but again, that's a very small percentage of the county land area that would have that. And I don't know that would have any impact on religious assembly uses. Certainly some could go in there, but that would be a choice to make. In that particular case would have potential maximums, but majority don't. It's get to more, the case by case review. Can you add in more parking based upon the constraints of the site?
And specifically, I'd like to say is that when Bill mentions the purple areas, it is the small purple areas shown within this hatched area. The purple areas are the property zone to the PTC district.
Right, and I think it's important to kind of reemphasize that even in these areas where we're considering parking maximums, it's a process to get that. It's not, if the property, if you're not rezoning to the PTC or a comparative zoning category in these other areas that are under consideration, or you don't want to opt in to that to create zero parking requirements and a maximum, then the property just retains the zoning that is already established for it, and there's no maximum parking requirement.
So just to make sure I'm hearing you right, Mr. Davis, so we're really talking about establishing minimums as opposed to trying to put maximums on what a site can support. I mean, that determination is kind of made through the exception process and the development of your site plan.
Correct. And I mean, that applies to all the uses that are currently in the zoning ordinance, with the exception of the information that we just shared with you about specific areas in the county, and further a process to get into that rather than just having it be imposed. The vast area of this county will still just have a minimum requirement and no maximum requirement.
I've asked, we mean about roughly 95% of the county. The only areas that could possibly have a maximum requirement would be the areas shown in purple here, which currently today have maximum requirements, and then possibly these areas in gray, which are your transit-oriented development or development that's within something like a quarter mile of metro, a little bit more than a quarter mile in some cases, but walkable from metro. And again, if you're within those areas, you are generally going to be subject to some other sort of zoning entitlement or approval for a change of use or development of land in some cases.
Does anybody else have any questions about the project or concerns or experiences associated with parking at religious assemblies?
So one thing I did want to make sure we re-emphasize again is we're looking at potentially removing the need to park schools and childcare and specialized instruction uses that would be in the religious assembly building separately. It's our take that those types of uses are typically done when they're not in worship services, so they're not competing demands for the parking areas. And the biggest need on the site, I think, as mentioned earlier, was the worship hours, and that's where the parking should be scheduled for. So potentially, that's an area where, again, you could build the parking you feel necessary, but may reduce the required parking by making that small change.
And the option's available today in the ordinance, but it requires a specific approval. So we're trying to set it up so that that's kind of built in to the rate, so that you wouldn't have to come through a special process to get essentially a shared parking approval. It would just be allowed as part of the religious assembly activities. Okay, well, unless anybody has any other information they'd like to share or questions, we appreciate the feedback that we've received today. And again, if you're continue to be interested in our parking project, please keep visiting the website. We'll have information about upcoming meetings, including ones with the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission, which are typically televised, as well as other community meetings that you'll have opportunities to participate in as we go along over the next 5 to 6 months.
And specifically, we're on June 14th, we'll be going to the board's land use policy committee. I believe it's 1 o'clock that we're going to be presenting to that. That's going to be on channel 16. So there's a link on the webpage that Bill put in the chat, so you can watch that. And during that meeting, we'll kind of better explain the map that I shared and overall beyond religious assembly type parking, how we're going to be, how we're proposing to regulate parking within the county going forward.
Thanks very much.
Drop a question in to Mike, myself, or Austin, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, and on the webpage there is a link to our shared mailbox. That if you have any questions, you can send that to us there, and we'll be happy to answer that, and any concerns or anything you would have. So again, we would highly suggest people check out that webpage and stay connected with us throughout this project.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your participation.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.